So thanks for coming on the channel, Joe. I really appreciate it.
I am super excited for this. I've been waiting so long for you to make a YouTube channel, and so I'm super pumped for it. I'm going to be
Yeah.
listening to it as I run or bike, as the case may be. So yeah,
Yeah, it's been a long time coming, but I'm glad you're my first guest, and I'm just glad I'm finally on the YouTube scene.
yes, I'm honored.
Uh,
I'm honored.
but yeah, today's topic of discussion is going to be how to write an A-level academic paper, and more specifically, we'll be going over the writing process that goes behind the scenes with your various publications. So, as many people may already know, you have academic papers. I think around seven now, and you have a couple under review. Am
We're
I
at
right?
9.
Oh my. Okay, so we're at nine. You've published a book, Majesty of Reason, and you have a book under contract with Springer, which is going to be coming up hopefully by the end of this year or next year.
Something
You
like that.
have you have YouTube videos, and you accompany a lot of these videos with 3,000 word documents. So
At minimum,
at minimum, and so you certainly are a prolific writer, and we have a broad range of work that we can sample from. But before we begin covering the various methods and recommendations you have for writing academic material, I'd just like to ask you some questions from the outset, sort of related to your exposure to philosophy, your early exposure, that is, just to get to know a little bit more about you and to break the ice. So, if you could you quickly tell us what got you interested in philosophy and what led you to specializing in philosophy of time with persistence, existential inertia, and philosophy of religion, interacting with models of God, classical theism, and whatnot?
yeah. So that's a wonderful question, and there's a lot to unpack there. But I'll try
Yes.
to make it brief. But yeah, so when I was younger, let's say first, second, third, fourth grade, I don't know. I went to a Christian private school, and I went there K through 12, actually. Not the same school, but I went to a private Christian school for both of those, K through 8, and then
Hmm.
for high school. And so I've been exposed to philosophy of religion like content ever since I was born, essentially. No, but we've had theology classes every single day in K through 8, and we had pretty advanced theology classes in high school. That's really close to philosophy of religion, and so that kind of sparked an interest in philosophy of religion. Now, as for how I got into philosophy, I don't quite know. I've always kind of been doing philosophy under the guise of just discussions and debates and things like that on topics that interested me. I remember in like fourth grade, I got this little iPod Touch when those were like, we'd play Angry Birds on them, and there's that little jumping game, where you like move the thing around and it jumps on the trampolines. Oh my goodness! And then there was also an ice cream game where you had to balance ice cream things like oh my goodness, and the ice cream would like fall down and you'd have to collect it. Anyway, fun stuff. But yeah, this is way back in fourth grade. I got one, and all my friends are downloading Instagram, so I downloaded Instagram. And naturally enough, I am very interested in topics at that time, things like abortion and other sorts of things that really I was interested in, like the pro-life, pro-choice debate. And like I engaged in like super substantive conversations that were like many, many paragraphs long in comment sections. And these were actually like substantive. We weren't like calling each other names. Like it was honestly just random people on the internet. But I just remember it being actually genuinely cordial and actually high level of discourse. So that kind of got my gears turning in a kind of argumentative mindset. And yeah, I did that all the time. So I was always like just debating and things like that, and so on. And that of course translated into discussions with classmates and other sorts of things. But yeah, I think the gateway drug was probably Instagram. So that really got me interested in it. But then I guess in seventh grade, I really started taking an interest in science and things like that, evolution in particular. I remember our class watched, so this is a private Christian school, but our class watched the Bill Nye Ken Ham debate, and we had to take notes on it. We had to discuss it with each other. It was so fun. It was so awesome. And of course, we were learning about evolution because this was a very science-friendly school, which is I'm very thankful for. But just getting into that sort of debate between young earth creationism, evolution, I started debating those sorts of things. I read up a ton of different books on evolution, and that kind of brought the questions with respect to Genesis. And then you started getting into the relationship between science and faith. And then, suddenly I was hit by the problem of evolutionary evil. And so there have been hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering. What am I supposed to do with that? This is the very means or mechanism by which God creates. so then the whole avalanche starts from there. So and then yeah, it's never looking back. I then got into the work of like Paul Draper very early on, and yeah, now I'm actually studying under him. So full circle. But yeah, anyway, that's I guess the
Yeah.
story.
Yeah, beautiful story, and I've heard this story countless times through, throughout all these interviews you've done. And also, for many people who may be asking, they're curious as to what our relationship is. Sometimes they'll see like guarded acumen shows up in, when I search up Joe for whatever reason. And yeah, I mean, I know a little bit about this story too, considering that, as you stated, we started off on Instagram, or rather, you started on Instagram, and you originally weren't even Majesty of Reason. You were Atheos Libertatum,
Oh my
and
gosh.
and the thing is, I remember you being one of those figures who wanted to have earnest debate, earnest
Yeah.
discussions, and I remember you had an obsession with evolutionary biology. You
Yes.
started getting into evolutionary problems from evil. So you started touching where you started dipping your toes into like philosophy, analytic philosophy. So I do remember all that. So I really do appreciate, though, you telling us a little bit more about yourself. And I actually think that at this point we can begin to transition to the topic of our discussion. But as a preliminary, I'd just like to say that, as it appears to me, and please feel free to interject whenever you'd like to add anything. But it would appear to me that the process of writing academic any academic paper, it's going to require that we at least do the minimal, like, or the following steps. We're going to have to begin by, well, doing what's pretty obvious, like choosing a research topic. We're going to then have to conduct our preliminary research, and then we're going to have to create a paper outline. And I'm going to segment the interview so as to permit us to touch on each of these topics. So, beginning with the first, that is choosing our research topic, taking your previous work, in fact, your first publication, Existential Inertia and the Aristotelian Proof. I'm curious to know, and I wonder what foreshadowed and spawned your motivation to both research the topic of existential inertia, and to respond to Phaser via an academic publication. So, to distill that down, how did you choose and narrow your research topic for your first paper?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So there's a kind of structural answer that applies to a lot of different papers that I've written, but also a kind of more historical contingency answer. So I'll kind of go over both of those. The historical contingency answer is that I think it was maybe freshman year, spring break, or something like that. So I think this is what, 2019 or something like that. Um, it might have been, well, I forget. Anyway, it was sometime spring break, I remember. And I was like, I'm bored. It's spring break. What am I going to do? And so I was like, well, there's this book that I haven't read yet. And it was Five Proofs of the Existence of God. And I was like, okay, I guess I'll give it a read. And I read the first chapter and I got through it. And I don't know, I was not as thrilled as I would have been. I was kind of disappointed by some of the argumentative steps and so on. And I thought that there were certain predicaments. And so I went, of course, the first thing that I did was I went on Instagram and discussed it with people that I knew had interest in the Aristotelian proof and so on. And I was discussing it. And I also discussed it with Josh Rasmussen and so on. I was articulating some of my problems and misgivings and criticisms and so on. And so I was kind of developing ideas just along the way naturally. And at some point I was like, hey, I want to get into philosophy. I need to start publishing. Or I didn't need to, but like I was like, hey, I can get ahead of the game if I can start publishing. I have some relatively novel ideas on these sorts of arguments. I've bounced them off professional philosophers, and I think I might be ready to publish. And so what I did was I started, of course, drafting up some of my own ideas, but also making sure that someone else hadn't already covered them in the literature. That's crucial. So the way that I picked my topic, in short, was that I was interested in the Aristotelian proof. I had relatively novel things to say about it. And thirdly, not many other people were saying things on it. Those were the key ingredients going into me writing that paper. And so I looked at the literature and I'm like, oh my goodness, no one's addressing this. So I need to address this because I have things to say on it. So yeah, that's kind of what I did. And then I wrote it up, submitted it to a journal, and yeah, the rest is history, I guess. So that's the kind of, yeah, that's the kind of historical contingency basis. I mean, the structural basis is, yeah, I found something that interests me, upon which I have or about which I have relatively novel ideas. And then I looked at the extant literature to see if those ideas had already been articulated, as well as seeing if I can incorporate or build upon other ideas that have been published. And then on the basis of that, I make an assessment as to whether or not I can get a paper out of this, whether or not I can get enough substance out of it, whether or not it's novel enough to warrant a paper, and whether or not it makes a significant enough contribution to the literature to be attractive to journal editors and so on. So yeah, that's my answer.
That's amazing. That's exactly what I was looking for out of response from you. So what I gathered here is you began by interacting with others. You mentioned interacting with Josh Rasmussen. I presume that that was over emails, and I guarantee that it wasn't just Rasmussen. I do recall you interacting with others on this topic, and
Yeah,
you offered or you made sure to keep a detailed summary of your thoughts,
yeah,
objections, just concerns, misgivings. You eventually came to writing, drafting a paper, or at least the skeleton of a paper. And then after that, you just looked into pre-existing literature. Is this something that's new? Is this something that's truly novel? Is this something that can contribute to pretty much academia? Is this something that is going to be of concern to anyone else? So I do have a related question that was submitted by somebody, and it was by our friend Anthony, and he asks, "How do you know when an idea is good enough for publication?" And it seems that really what you gave us is pretty much sufficient for answering the question. But if you do have anything else to add to that, um, I'd like to hear what you'd like to say to that.
yeah. So that's a good question. How do I know? How do I know I'm not a brain in a vat? I mean, no, there are lots of different there are lots of different pointers that can, I don't know, indicate. There really isn't going to be a silver bullet type answer to this.
Hmm.
But what you need to do is, like I said, you need to look at the literature. And how do you do that? Well, if you want to respond to a piece, what you do is you go on to Google Scholar, you type in that piece, and you click on the references, or you just find the piece wherever it was published, and you look at the citations, rather, not references, excuse me, the citations of it, and you just go through the citations. You see whether or not people have published responses to it. A lot of the citations will just be either book reviews, or they'll just be supporting material, or they'll just be irrelevant, and there'll just be like a footnote where it's like they mention it. But sometimes you'll find one that is just a direct answer or a direct response to the paper in question. Other times you won't. So the thing you need to do is to find the citations of the thing that you might want to respond to, assuming that you're writing a response paper. And then, yeah, just see if, firstly, there are such responses, and secondly, whether or not your own thoughts and ideas are contained in them. And by doing that, by this kind of literature survey, you can get a sense of whether or not your idea is relatively novel. It has to be, firstly, relatively novel, and secondly, has to make a significant enough contribution to the debate. If it's just like some minor distinction that would apply to some sub-response to a particular counter argument, like that's not going to be worthy enough. But if you're targeting a major premise of something that has wider significance, let's say in both metaphysics and philosophy of religion and philosophy of time, like I did with the existential inertia thesis, right? That is definitely going to be much more worthy of publication. So it kind of just depends on what you're responding to or what your article is on. It depends on whether or not you're making a significant enough contribution. How do you tell that? Well, I don't know. Just think about the dialectical context. Think about, does it have connections to other domains? What's the significance of it? And you can include in your paper, you can explain why this is significant, because sometimes you submit to journals and the referees are like, it's a good paper, but it just doesn't really say much that's significant. It doesn't really contribute all that much to the literature. So I don't know. You just need to kind of practice with it, get a feel for what's significant, what's not, and yeah, draw out connections between your debate and wider debates and so on. So yeah, that's kind of the thing to do. And I guess I mentioned Google Scholar, but other places you can find these sorts of things are Phil papers. You can go on to academia.edu. You can use JSTOR. There are lots of different things that you can use, and a simple Google search. I mean, that shouldn't be the end all. That shouldn't be the final thing or the only thing that you do. But yeah.
No, yeah, I actually like that. So another fundamental point that you raised was looking at the literature. And where do you do that? Well, you mentioned Google Scholar. Another good resource is Crossref or Cross-Reference, which actually shows up on the page of academic papers. So for instance, if you go to like religious studies and you click on a paper, I think below like the DOI number, it should actually give you a button that allows you to check the cross-reference, and that will directly show you every single paper that cites or responds to the paper in question that you're viewing. And so I find that to be very useful. Now, obviously, if I were to add anything, there is no template or a strict guideline for writing a paper. Writing is something that fundamentally is going to come from undergoing practice, experience, learning more about organization. And so there surely are some guidelines and some expectations that we may have for writing a paper, but I think that the information which you provided us is, I think, adequate for us moving on to the next uh, topic that we have, and that's going to be on how do we conduct preliminary research once we have figured out what research topic we want to write on. So, when we look at a later publication of yours, from modal collapse to providential collapse, we see that you cite numerous sources. In fact, you have 3 pages worth of references at the end of the paper. And these are no doubt rigorous sources. So, another point of advice would be to read. Read a lot. Because if you don't read, then you're not going to know what's in these academic publications. You won't see what's out there. So, for instance, you cite Van Inwagen, Leftow, Brouwer, Vallicella, Stump, all towering intellects in their own respects. So, could you tell us how did you go about collecting, and not only collecting, but weaving together these disparate sources so that you could construct the paper, well, really as you did? Are there methods for how you collect these papers or how you read and consume the literature? Yeah.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I like these questions because some of them are quite difficult to answer,
They,
which,
they are
this
pretty
is,
broad and pretty like,
yeah,
yeah, they're pretty broad. So if
it's
you'd like, I
good.
mean, you can like think of like some more concrete, examples, keep it a little bit more local.
Yeah. So what I do is usually I make numerous documents for each paper that I want to write. So I make documents. One of them is just the preliminary source gathering. So, I look at the things that we were mentioning, like field papers, academia.edu, so on. I look at the cross references, citations, that is. And yeah, I gather all those. Any paper that cites the thing that I want to be engaging with or the topic, I gather those. And then I plump them all, I plop them all in a big Google document, and then I go through them and see how relevant they are to my particular ideas, whether or not they touch on the argument that I'm responding to or the argument that I'm constructing, and so on. So I go through them and I start winnowing down the list. I start eliminating ones that I don't think are going to be relevant. I kind of prioritize them. I say, this one will be super relevant. I need to read this one in a lot of detail, take notes on it, and so on. Another one I might just need to skim, or I might just only need to look at a particular section. So I put that in like, hey, skim this one, or look at section 1. And this is all in that document that I'm winnowing down. And by the end of this, I'll have some number of sources that I need to go through, some of which I'm going through much more meticulously than others. And yeah, that's the kind of preliminary stage. The next thing to do then is you could go one of two ways. You could start writing up your own paper, and then where relevant, you then go and read up the papers. So like if I'm working on the section on articulating modal collapse arguments, I could write what some of my thoughts in that section, and then I go to the particular papers that articulate them. And then I can, cite some sources from there. That's one option. You could kind of do a mixture. You could go from writing your own paper to writing, reading the stuff that's relevant to what you're writing. Or another option is that you just read all those things first and kind of extract what you think you're going to potentially directly cite or paraphrase, or what's most relevant to what you want to get or what you want to write in your own paper. And sometimes I go one of those approaches, another time I don't know, it just varies. So again, there isn't a one size fits all. As for going from there, I usually have perhaps another document, or maybe in the same document, I start making an outline of my own ideas and precisely where I'm going to be citing those things that I just mentioned. And then once you have that, you can go on to actually writing the paper. And so, yeah, I mean, we've covered how to find them. We've covered how to collect them together in a document, how to winnow them down, and then ultimately placing them, placing them in what sections and where and so on. And I guess how to get through them all, well, it just takes organization and diligence, the biggest thing is being organized, you can't just like plop down all these different references and then go through and read every single paper and try to highlight every single passage. You need to know in advance kind of what you want to get for your paper, what you want to get out of it, what you're interested in, and what you need to extract. So a lot of it takes foreplanning, right? You're probably going to want to have in mind a paper outline while, or even before you're doing this preliminary research, just a rough outline. Again, later on, you can get a much more detailed outline, but this kind of rough outline it guides you, like it lets you know where you're going to go into the preliminary research. So yeah, I know it's a bit scattered answer, but there's a lot of ways to answer it. So
No, that was quite an answer, and I really do appreciate it. These were some of the points that I gathered from it. So, I mean, for starters, the first thing that you mentioned was writing a document, compiling all the information, all the requisite information that you need. Pretty much be bibliographic, get a bibliography, collect all the sources that you think, or rather, all the sources that are required for the topic at hand. And then you can organize them by their relevancy. You can gather quotations from the documents. In fact, in the paper that I cited, Modal Collapse to Providential Collapse, in that paper, I believe the beginning section, you dedicate the first two sections, I believe. Yeah, I think it's the first two, but you dedicate the beginning part of the paper to just outlining the literature, right? You're writing for an audience who you're going to presume doesn't know anything about this topic, that is modal collapse, and that's going to require that you have a grasp and a knowledge of, well, really the literature. So quotations would be great. Notes, I think you also mentioned that we take notes in documents. Additionally, you say that we have to set up the discussions. We also, well, I think this is something that's obvious enough. Read a lot, and I think that's going to be something that's going to be like just a motif, a recurring theme throughout this interview, which is you're going to have to do a lot of reading to stay caught up with the literature in order to really have a grasp of what it is that you want to talk about. And in which case, if you weren't to do that, I don't think you're going to have anything too substantive to contribute to the field. And then additionally, you mentioned on top of that, outlining. And that's another thing that I think I believe is worth noting. If anyone's familiar with any of your YouTube videos or your blogs, I think they'll notice that you have quite an obsession really with overviews and outlines. I think just about
yes.
every single lecture video you have, we have a slide outlining, giving us the purpose, the scope, the nature of the video lecture. Um, Organizing your thoughts, I think, is going to be one of the most important things for writing. Keeping everything organized, knowing who it is that you're writing for, what you're going to be writing. And that's going to be a virtue, really, of writing. I think that's greatly exemplified by really all of your works, really just giving us a really easy, concise summary of what it is that you're going to cover. Do you have anything to say with respect to the outlines?
Yeah, no, I love my outlines. In some of my recent videos, I'm like, as a lot of you listeners who've watched my videos know, I love my outlines. I
Yes.
was just re-listening to one of the earlier portions of one of my videos just for kicks and giggles, and I said that I'm like, oh my goodness. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's amazing. And like later on in the process, outlines basically write the paper for you. I mean, it makes it so much easier. Like what you do is like I'll have like one introduction, and then I'll be like, what do I want to cover in the introduction? Well, first, I actually need to define simplicity, define modal collapse, define necessity, and so on. Secondly, I need to outline the extant literature. Thirdly, uh, I need to state what I'm going to be my thesis, what I'm going to be arguing in this paper. And fourth, I need to specify why this paper is significant, why I'm trying to sell it to the referees and to the journal editors. So what's the significance? And then that's the introduction. And then two, I'll outline the arguments that I'm going to be examining. I'll outline the justification for the premises. So I'll be like, here's the first kind of argument, the simple modal collapse argument. I'm going to be, articulating his premises and then look at the justification for each premise. And so on. So like you go through and you just list the things that you want to be talking about. And then when it comes to writing, you're like, okay, I have 4 bullet points there, so I need one paragraph dedicated to explaining that. And there's built-in flexibility, but the outlines write it for you essentially. And when I do outlines, also, I just do like bullet pointed responses and counter rejoinders. So it's like I'll have the argument, and then just a bullet point response will be like premise 1 is ambiguous, and then I'll be like the ambiguity is between this and this, and then below that I'll be like if the person takes that route, well then they're going to face this problem, and then if they take the other route, the other disambiguation, they're going to face this problem. Here's how someone might respond to these. So you do the indentation within your outline. And then you do your counter responses. You do a further indentation. And then again, these are just like really one sentence things because you have them in your mind. The thing is, when you're writing, then you go through it and you articulate it and you signpost and so on. But that gives you a sense of where you are in the dialectic. I find that all too often when we're engaged in the middle of a discussion, you might be just targeting one premise of a particular argument for a particular thesis. And within that premise, there was a sub-argument for the premise. And then there was just one premise within that sub-argument which has one term, which is ambiguous. And you take the ambiguity, you go down two different routes that, you could disambiguate A or B. And then within those, people have an objection to what you tease out of those. And so then you have to respond to that objection. Like, you're so far into the dialectic. If you don't have an outline and you don't explicitly tell your audience where you're going and what you're doing when you write the paper based on your outline, well, then you're just going to lose yourself. You're going to lose yourself and the audience, and so on. So always just keep track. Dialectical context and outlines really help that, and they help remind people who ultimately has that, like, a burden of proof and onus of justification as well, like whether or not someone's offering an undercutting, rebutting, defeater, because you can trace back through your outline what is the original argument, who was here originally offering the positive claim, and so on. So outlines are just amazing. And I mean, usually I go through multiple different outlines for papers, because the first one is just, you're just trying to get a sense of what the hell you're going to write about. But then later on, once you've done some research, once you've collected some quotes, then you do like a detailed outline point by point oftentimes. And then the paper writes itself essentially.
Getting well detailed outlines is going to be something that I think will be also another recurring theme throughout. I wouldn't call it an illustration, but this is how I picture it in my head, at least. But, at least when I do outlines, because you definitely influence me. Whenever I write now, everything begins with an outline. Really, I just see it as main points, sub points, sub points. And if you want to get even more meta, sub points. So as you said, getting fine grained distinctions, being able to track what it is that's going through your mind. I really like how you said that. So this is kind of how I have it in my head, but hopefully you can see it. But, something like this, main point, sub points, and something like just keeping it simple, just a sentence long, just to gather your thoughts, keep yourself organized. Now, I have one last question on this topic, which is, now we may end up coming to, or we may find ourselves in a situation where we want to study a topic that hasn't been addressed before, or maybe there's been little research done. So for instance, existential inertia is a great example of this. I think there were only 3 individuals who were at least explicitly writing literature on existential inertia prior to you entering the field, and it was Paul Audi, Phaser, and who's the last? It was Boydwin. There you go. So you were really working in a market that was suffering from a great degree of scarcity on the topic of existential inertia. Now, I understand that you ended up finding some really obscure writings, like
there's like a dissertation. There's like a dissertation by this one random dude, and he only talks about it for like 2 paragraphs on page 73 or something. Like, you'll find those every once in a while. But in terms of explicit contributions, you could count them on one hand prior to that paper. And still, it only requires like 2 hands. So hopefully my forthcoming book, not to interrupt you too much, but hopefully my forthcoming book, co-authored with Dan Linford, will spark that debate further and enliven it, invigorate it.
There we go. And not to mention, there, I think Sobel touched on it just a little bit in his book Logic and Theism, just a bit. But what suggestions do you have for people who want to research these novel topics? I mean, when you're facing scarcity, I mean, what did you do in your case? I mean, it seems that you kind of covered what you touched on earlier, which was you conducted a lot of research on the literature, you were reading a lot. Is there anything else, or have we exhausted really everything that's needed to answer the question?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting because even finding the topic, it's so difficult. Just like finding that little niche, or I know some people say niche, but whatever. Finding that little, I don't know, just finding it was, somehow it was a miracle for me, because it's like, it was perfect because this is on the cusp of current research. It's super duper important. It relates to a bunch of different fields. So it was like a perfect opportunity. So like, I consider myself lucky for that, right? I'm not like praising myself. I'm praising the fact that I was utterly lucky to be at this particular joint in the literature blossoming process. So I kind of lucked out there because just not much work on it. And it's just it's ripe for future research and so on. So I kind of lucked out with that. Now my recommendation is for other people to try to find those sorts of areas, So I guess there are like recent papers that are being written on certain subtopics that are relatively new and within fields, like there's a lot of stuff that's pretty interesting on moral luck as of late and how it afflicts both libertarians and compatibilists and so on. And like, that's kind of like a blossoming field that hasn't seen too much work in the like the long past. Now it's seeing a lot more work, but like that's another kind of area. But like the thing is, try to find those sorts of areas, and yeah, and then follow all the steps that we've kind of covered already. I guess one final thing is that in the earliest stages of your career or your writing and so on, it is easiest to do a response paper because oftentimes journals are, they like, so they don't like too much. They don't want to have all and only of their papers just to be referencing one another within that particular journal and so on. So it's just like a little in-house game. But they do like interaction within their journal, right? They like people reading their journal and having a response to it and having that healthy engagement within the literature. And so journals are often open to those sorts of things. If someone's recently written an article and you have a reply to it, that's a relatively easy, that's probably the easiest kind of I've been told this as well by different professors. And like in early on in your career, the easiest paper to write is a response paper, because everything that like you're just responding to a recent paper. It's one paper. It's almost guaranteed to be on the cusp of research, as long as you're contributing novel ideas to what that particular person said, who already had the novel ideas to be able to publish that. So it's like you're already, a lot of the work has already been cut out for you. So yeah, that's another suggestion. Just when you're starting out your research, do a response paper or something like that. So mine was like it was partial response to Phaser's Aristotelian, but it was also partial building. I was constructing models of existential inertia and so on. But yeah, response papers are good starters. Because journals are open to them, it's relatively easy. The space within the literature is already carved out. So lots of pluses for response papers.
Not to mention that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think really the field of philosophy now has just been focusing on highly specialized fields. So I think that at this point, I think the difficulty of finding topics to discuss really is just going to come from maybe our poverty of imagination. I think there's always going to be some niche that you can touch on. Some of the most fundamental or some of the most like mundane topics have yet to have been touched on. So really though, you're saying that the whole literature concerning existential inertia just sort of came by luck, but I think that most of the information that we gave prior to that, I think, should be sufficient for helping our friend there with their question.
Yeah, and I mean,
Mhm.
like I said, I'm sure that there are other like uh, existential inertia type sorts of things in these other domains that we're
Yeah.
just, you and I aren't aware of. But if we looked into it, I'm sure in the early stages of the more luck literature, that's exactly what it was
Oh, I
like.
see.
And I'm sure there are lots of other, and like epistemic injustice, Miranda Fricker, like when she kind of hit the nail on the head with that one, that kind of
Yeah.
blossomed to literature and so on. So like being aware of recent developments and where not much is written, and oftentimes people who publish recent papers, they'll say, hey, this topic hasn't been written much. And they'll cite like the extant literature, and it will be like 4 papers. Like that's like that should be a light bulb moment. You're like,
Yeah.
oh, I can read those 4 papers and get a
Mhm.
comprehensive grasp on the literature on this particular point.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah.
That actually does. There is. From in philosophy of time, particularly in temporal ontology, there is an area that hasn't been touched on, and I think there are only about like 2 papers. One's written by Ross Inman, and it's another that it's just by like some Polish author. It's on what's called serious presentism, and that's been completely lacking. So if anyone's actually interested in finding topics, really just look for like these singular papers, see if anyone else is talking about them, and really I think that's going to be your vantage point. I think that's when you should pounce and start writing, and
Yeah,
really
and
just taking all the advice that we've been giving. Yeah.
there are a lot of these as well. Like I was saying how lucky I was earlier. That's because like a lot of these different benefits all conjoined into one space. But there are a lot of these. Like, so if you just go on to like recent papers by different journals like Noose or Mind or IJPR, and you'll find a lot of these different like kind of cutting edge topics there. For instance, one that just comes to mind right now, Christopher Cowie has an argument. He has a paper in Noose. It's called like A New Argument for Moral Error Theory or something. And he talks about like population axiology and so on. Like that has like a couple citations, and it's a new argument, and it's situated within questions that are immensely important. So you've got that knocked down. It's a new argument. So like if you're responding to it, you're probably going to be saying things that are reasonably cutting edge and so on. So it's like find those sorts of papers, like,
Yeah.
just a new take on an old question, things like that.
Yeah.
So that's yet another one. Just things as we talk about it, things are just coming to mind. So
Oh
I'm
yeah, there's a
sure,
whole bunch.
yeah. So like just look at different journals and some of their recent issues within the past 2 3 years, something like that. So
Yeah. One other just to give one last example, but you're right, there's so many that are coming to mind, but one other great example that kind of that's in philosophy of religion is axiology of theism. I think
yeah.
there's only about two authors, Kirk Lougheed and I forget the other, that have touched on the topic of the axiology of theism,
Well,
talking about
now it's
protheism.
yeah.
I mean,
As of within the last 2 years, it's been blossoming.
there we go.
But like
So,
go back
mhm,
like 2 years ago or something, or just a couple years ago, and yeah, it had not been touched on all that much. But now
yeah.
you're getting collected papers on it, and
Mhm.
yeah. So
Well, I think we've covered enough ground on the topic of collecting, or rather doing, your preliminary research right after you have selected your research topic. So I think at this point we can move on to the third section, and that's going to be touching on how we create research paper outlines. We've already kind of touched on this earlier, but I do have some things worth noting. So, for instance, if we look at your latest paper, and I'm pretty sure you've already announced this, um, and that's your paper on naturalism, classical theism, and first causes. This is a response paper to it's Enric Gel, is that right? Enric?
I don't know how to pronounce it.
Yeah,
I
I think it's
mean,
Enric.
well, yeah, well, it's definitely it might be Enrique, because it's a Spanish name. So,
Mm,
and plus, I know in Spanish it tends to be the case that when you have a G followed by like an E, right? It's ch, so it's like, but gel sounds not the
yeah, I
greatest. So I'm guessing
think
it's
it's Gel.
gel.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think it's gel as well. But yeah,
but yeah. So in this latest paper, in this paper that you just recently got accepted for publication, just keeping this in consideration, I believe that we can see how you structure your papers quite clearly in this paper. I mean, you can see it in all of your papers, but I think it's shown most clearly in this. I mean, just to borrow some terms and phrases from Brett Mensch and Conrad Cording, I mean, it looks to me that when you write your papers, you either conscientiously or just unknowing, I don't know, but you focus your paper on you focus your paper on a central contribution. You communicate that in the title. You write for flesh and blood human beings who don't know your work. You introduce us through really everything that we need to know in order to read your paper. You stick to what they call what's called the triple C scheme. That is, you give us context, you then follow it up with a huge body of content, and then you give us a really well defined conclusion. You give us a complete story in the abstract. You communicate why the paper matters. This is another thing that I wish more people did, which is how can we situate this in, as you like to focus on, a dialectical context that is going to be relevant to people who are interested in that field. So people in philosophy of religion are going to want to know how your contribution is going to settle problems in the field, and you deliver the results of your research in a really clear, concise sequence of statements that support the central claim that you make. And I believe these are virtues that both your previous and present work does. So I'm curious now. We already touched on how you outline your papers, but when you're outlining, what are you looking for? Are you looking for communicating to a really broad audience? Do you like speaking to a really niche audience? Like, really, what are your expectations for writing the paper? Clarity, developing the dialectical context. Like, what is it that you're searching for when you write these papers?
yeah. So I guess there's this distinction between writing the paper outline and writing the paper. So when I'm writing the outline, it's in Joe
Hmm.
speak, right? So it's in my own language that I understand and that would
I
make
see.
most sense to me. So there'll be abbreviations, there will be uh, any number of things that shouldn't appear in published writing. um, yeah. So yeah. So paper outline, set that aside. As for writing the paper, what am I aiming for? What am I
Yeah,
trying to do? Uh, yeah, like you said, clarity is the number one, right?
yeah,
Clarity is king. That's definitely number one. If it's not clear, it's I almost said worthless, but that's not true because poetry isn't the clearest, but that's certainly not worthless. But for philosophy, if it's not clear, then it's
yeah.
probably closer to the worthless side. But yeah, so it definitely needs to be clear. Clarity is king. That's the number one thing. It also needs to be precise, well defined. You could make a distinction between clarity and precision, and well, I probably can't do that off the top of my head, but
Yeah.
precision is making something that's well defined and you know exactly what it's saying. And clarity is a matter of conveying that precision in a way that people can understand. Because you can have a precise logical formula, but you might just be terrible at communicating it. So anyway, try to be both precise and clear, and concise as well. Like, don't add all this fluff like, oh, ever since the dawn of time, humans have been thinking about the God question, like those sorts of things. Like,
Mm-hmm.
don't, no, that's not okay. So clear, concise, precise, skip the fluff. And yeah, like, imagine, so I get this, and I know we were talking about this a couple of maybe days ago or last week or something like that, but like, my professors have told me, assume that your audience or assume that your reader is mean, lazy, and stupid. Okay. So they're mean and that they're going to try to interpret you in the most uncharitable way possible, which means you need to be as clear as possible so as to avoid that, so that you can point to, like, I said the contrary thing on page 4. So those sorts of things. So that's the meanness criterion. Secondly is laziness. So they're going to be lazy. The reader isn't going to be wanting to doing the heavy lifting with respect to the thinking. So you need to spell it out for them. And what that means is that don't just say, oh, well, the proof of this is trivial, or the proof of that is easy or obvious. Spell it out. Okay. Spell it out. Explain why a particular thing is ambiguous, explain what the ambiguity is, or explain why it's question begging, what the dialectical context is, who has the burden of justification, maybe give a concrete example to help that. The thing is, don't make your reader do the thinking. You do the thinking for them and put it out there, right? So that's the laziness thing. You need to spell out the steps required to get your reader to basically just read it and get it, okay? Okay, I should, before I go on, I want to emphasize to the audience that I am by no means perfect at these sorts of things. I am conveying tips that I've been told and that I try to do well at, but of course I fail at these. And yeah, I just wanted to say that it's not as though I'm pontificating from some kind of perfect chair. No, no. Okay, so I just wanted to get that out of the way. These are just helpful tips. I'm trying to help people here, not okay. Anyway, I've experienced, as you could see, I've been scarred by by mean comments that
No,
are like
really,
things like that.
I think we need more people failing like you, because I think you've done an excellent job keeping all these things in mind.
Okay, yeah, yeah. So, but I
Go
just want
on.
to continue. I was just going to say, like, as you can see, I've been scarred by people like. Anyway, if I'm trying to give someone a tip, they're like, "Oh,
Yeah.
well, you're not perfect at that." It's like, oh. Anyway, so that was the second one. That I covered the mean one, I covered the lazy one, and now the stupid one. So again, assume that they're kind of stupid. So like don't assume that they understand what necessary and contingent are just because they're supposed to be professional philosophers reading about or reading in philosophy of religion. Don't assume that. You need to have it like a footnote saying, by contingent, here's what I mean, or something like that. I mean, unless it's like an obvious term that absolutely everyone in philosophy knows 101 basics, like valid or something, or like sound. Okay. So yeah, assume that they're stupid. Define things. Yeah, spell out the arguments in premise by
Yeah.
premise form, because it allows you to say, like, I'm targeting this premise right now, okay? Because sometimes people are like, oh, I don't even see how that's relevant to his argument. Well, it's like, if you spell out the argument premise by premise form, well, then you can, the stupid reader won't have room for complaint. I'm not saying that people who read the papers are actually stupid. I'm saying your hypothetical reader in mind when you're writing, imagine them to be mean, lazy, and stupid.
Yes.
And that's a pretty good guide. So
Yeah. These are really just like you're telling us, to anticipate things for the process of writing, and fundamentally, you have to keep in mind things like clarity, precision, rigor. You have to determine the nature and scope of the paper. You mentioned the footnotes, and this actually ties into a question that we received. Our friend Ryan had actually asked, "How do you use footnotes? Do you just use these for side comments, or is this for argumentation?" I mean, I can't name you all the books I've seen that have a page length worth of footnotes. And how is that going to play a role in, well, satisfying this criteria? I mean, meanness, laziness, stupidity. I mean, how when should you be using these footnotes? Should you be clear throughout the body of the paragraphs, or should you just say, you know what, I'll go on as I usually do, and I'll just write everything down in the bottom?
yeah, oh my goodness, that's such a good question. And I remember I saw him when he asked that, and I was
Mm,
like, I was reflecting on it. I'm like, oh my goodness, like, well, because I don't know, when you're into the groove, when you've been writing papers and so on, and you're starting to get used to it, and you've read a lot of different articles, and so you just start to have a kind of spidey sense. I don't know. I just know when. I mean, that's not to say that like I put them perfectly or my footnotes are perfect. Or, no, not at all. But like I just have this kind of sense where it's appropriate, when it's appropriate, why it's appropriate, just by reading lots of other people do it. And I don't know, like there are a bunch of different reasons why you might have a footnote. One of them is like if, for instance, I want to define contingent and necessary, and I think that everyone should really know what that means, but I still want to define it anyway. I'm not going to waste room in the main text. I'm just going to put a footnote and say, okay, here's what I mean by necessary and contingent for those of you who need a refresher or something like that. And so like what that allows people to do is like if they already know what contingent and necessary means, they can either skip it or they can just see how I'm using it. So I mean, another reason why you might do it is just like if you're running roughshod over a potential distinction that would like if you were to explain it, it would take you on a huge tangent in your main paper. But like you still need to mention it because you're like a reviewer will definitely point this distinction out. So like that's another place where you could have a footnote. It's like here's that distinction, but here's why ultimately I think it's irrelevant, or why both of those disjuncts are irrelevant to my argument. My argument would go through either way. It's like oftentimes it's addressing these like somewhat minor questions or minor like objections that you like really suspect will come up in a reviewer's mind, or that people have brought up to you that you think are like kind of irrelevant but still important to because it might bring out some clarity and so on. Like I don't know, oftentimes that gets you into a little bit of a tangent territory, and it would just definitely derail the paper. You're in this flow mode in your paper and you have this narrative that you're building, and then you'd have to stop to address this like mildly irrelevant, somewhat relevant thing, and then you'd have to give like a number of sentences explaining it that disrupts your paper's flow and so on. So like that's where it's really nice to have a footnote. Yeah, so there are a bunch of different reasons why you might have a footnote, and you kind of just need to develop a sense for it. Sometimes it's for defining terms, although if it's an important definition, you should have that in your main thing. Sometimes it's just because it would disrupt the flow of your paper. Other times it's like you're anticipating objections that like aren't really worthy of being in the main text, but like you still need to put them there. Yeah, and oftentimes also they're for citation. So it's like you might be taking a particular stance that's like held by a number of philosophers, but there are a few band of skeptics, and you need to cite them. Like, hey, I am assuming, let's say, grounding monism here, and there are some people such as X, Y, and Z who argue for grounding pluralism or whatever. So yeah, those are some reasons why you might have footnotes. I can't go over all the different reasons, but at some point when you read a bunch of different papers and you practice these sorts of things, you will develop that spidey sense.
Yeah. There are differing opinions. For instance, if you saw Ryan's question, then you should have seen Liz's response. I think she says something along the lines of, if it's not worthy of putting in the main body, just get rid of it. So you get people
No.
in the different on different polls.
Yeah, I have to admit that I'm firmly against that camp, because like there are some things where it's just like it is related, and so it's like you need to address it because like a reviewer is probably going to bring it up, but it's like it's not related enough to go into the main body. So it's like I don't want to cover this because people should be able to see that it's irrelevant, but I still have to spell it out because you're assuming that your reader is mean, lazy, and stupid. So you need to put that in there. So yeah, I guess I'm firmly against that. Now I am firmly in the camp that you should try to minimize footnotes, just because like, listen, yeah, the main text is where you want things to be as clear as possible, and that's the main thing, because a lot of people don't even read the footnotes. So you want to minimize your footnotes and minimize their length. Particularly if you have lazy readers, don't have a page-long footnote. Those are really annoying. So I try to avoid those. I try to keep it to like one paragraph, and it's not a super long paragraph. So anyway, try to minimize them, but sometimes you need a footnote to either make a clarification or get rid of an objection that's somewhat relevant but also somewhat irrelevant, or if there's literature on the side topic that you need to cite because it has a contrary opinion to you, and you need to flag that you're aware of that, that you're setting that aside by stipulation. So I think there are lots of different legitimate reasons to have footnotes, but I agree with her that they should be minimized. Don't overly rely on them or make them pages long.
We don't want to create a battle here right now.
Yeah.
But I think it's worth noting though that I think that we're nearing our time. So, unfortunately, we probably won't be able to get to all of the questions, but just to end the discussion, I think
Let's do one or two more.
you're okay with doing one or two more?
Yeah, one or
Perfect.
two more.
Okay,
Let's do the
cool.
first
So,
one and then
okay,
we'll
perfect. So, the next one does come from Liz, and this is in relation to your upcoming book with Dan Linford. She asks you what inspires you to write the book, namely the upcoming book, and how do you approach co-authoring?
Yeah. Okay, what inspired the book? Well, lots of things inspired it, I guess. I mean,
Yeah.
my research thus far has kind of inspired it. What's nice is that I've done a lot of research on like related topics that kind of build on one another. They're all kind of related to classical theism, arguments for and against it, as well as existential inertia and persistence and so on. So they have a nice kind of family resemblance to one another, such that they could be the ideas could be woven together into a book. I'm interested in these topics. I think that uh, there's a niche in the literature. No one thus far has written a book length a book addressing either existential inertia, which is astonishing. There hasn't been a book length defense or systematic just laying out of the land of existential inertia. That just needs to be done. A bunch of different accounts need to be developed of it. It needs to be articulated. There's been a lot of ambiguity and imprecision in the literature on it. People define it differently. So that's really sad. So there's a huge niche in literature. Not many people have addressed Phaser's proofs, and of the people who have, namely me and Oppie, we've only really targeted the Aristotelian proofs, so I can now finally go through all the other ones. There are so many different reasons. And like, why Phaser? Well, partly just my historical contingencies of coming across his book on that spring break. Also, partly because, yeah, he's a little bit polemical, and I want to combat his polemicism. Yeah, says atheists aren't part of the real debate, and I'm like, press X to doubt. So, yeah. So, yeah, anyway, a lot of different reasons. And also,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think classical theism is intrinsically fascinating. I think questions about persistence are intrinsically fascinating. These things are just super interesting. So it's a combination of historical contingencies and continuations of my own research, and there being really good niche here that I can fill, and a combination of, yeah, intrinsic interest and so on. So, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, and
and
what was the second question?
yeah, the second part, and you know what? I think Anthony asks another question, which really just expands on the second part of Liz's question, which is co-authoring a good time or is it a bad time? Like, how do you go about co-authoring? Is it something? Is it just dependent on who you're co-authoring with? I mean, what was your
Yeah,
experience like with Dan?
it depends on the person. Usually if it's nice if you both are in like related but different fields, like subfields of philosophy. So like Daniel J. Linford, who's the co-author, he's the second author on the first. He is like in the know with philosophy of physics. So like
Yeah.
he knows a ton of stuff about like wave function monism and all Alyssa Ney's recent work and Jill North and Barber and all these other philosophers. He also knows a ton about relativity theory and the science side of that and how it relates to um, different models of persistence and so on. And I can bring into that a lot of the philosophy of religion side of things, like the metaphysics of models of God and the existential inertia debate and so on. And so it's a really nice synergy. So I think the best thing to try to do is get a synergy between two different. If two people specialize on exactly the same question and so on, it might not be the best co-authoring thing because, like, I don't know, there's a really nice play of ideas between people who have slightly different specialties. So it's like you're able to complement one another in unique ways. It's like one person fills in the other person's gaps, right? So yeah, my experience overall has been very good in co-authoring and so on. It oftentimes means less individual work. Sometimes it means that well, anyway, it just gives you a broader lens through which to view questions because you have this co-author who has their own experiences and has done their own research and knows their own body of work that we can cite and so on. So yeah, usually it's a good time. It depends on who you're doing it with. Just do it with someone who's chill and smart and nice and so on. So who like shares the values that you do. Yeah, that's my
Yeah.
that's my stick.
I think we covered really broad ground. I think we've covered a lot of material here, and just to kind of recap on what it is that we touched on. I mean, we began by talking about how we choose a research topic, how we conduct preliminary research, and then finally Excuse me. And then finally, we touch on how it is that you approach not only the outline but the writing process. And we were able to touch on uh, some submitted questions, and I think that just about caps up or summarizes just everything that I wanted to touch on. So I just want to say thank you, Joe, for interacting with me and joining me for this interview. I think that this is going to be a great and fruitful resource for individuals who just want to have a little bit more insight about how it is that you approach writing, the tips and recommendations you have. But I think that just about covers it. If you liked this interview and if you enjoyed the interaction we had, please, if you can, it's my first video, drop me a like, leave me constructive criticisms in the comments, and if you could, please subscribe. I hope to have a lot more content in the future. I'd like to talk about other topics like philosophy of time, philosophy of religion, and other things in between. But thank you for joining me, and I hope you have a great time.